Boa tarde a todas e todos que estão nos acompanhando no evento de hoje. Esse que é o primeiro esforço internacional do Métodos em Pauta. Nós temos a honra de contar com a presença do professor Carl Knutsen. O nosso convidado é professor da Universidade de Oslo, na Noruega, e também é um dos pesquisadores principais do projeto Varieties of Democracy, conhecido também como V-Dem. Hoje ele vai falar um pouco sobre o projeto em si e também fará uma breve apresentação de um paper recém-publicado na revista Democratization, que analisa a relação entre democracia e desenvolvimento humano. So, Professor Knutsen, thank you for taking the time to talk to us. We do understand that you are 4 hours ahead of us, so we are really intruding in the middle of your night, so sorry about that. And if you will, you can make a presentation now, and later you have a few minutes to question and answer. Is that okay?
That's fantastic. Thank you, Rodrigo, and thanks for inviting me to this presentation. So then I guess I'll try to share my screen. Let's see, share screen. Let's see. Okay. Well, thanks again. It's given the circumstances, of course, it's great to be able to speak to you via the internet. I would have loved to be in Brazil right now, of course, but since it's difficult to travel, then I guess this is a good chance to speak about the V-Dem Project via broadcast. So basically this presentation, I'm going to talk a lot about the varieties of democracy, or the V-Dem project and data collection in particular. So the different democracy measures and different indicators of particular institutions that we have in the V-Dem dataset. Then I'm going to kind of draw some lines and talk about potential implications this dataset has for how we're going about in researching big questions in democracy research now and in the future. And then finally, I'm going to show one piece of research that I've recently been engaged in on electoral democracy and human development. So these are the three kind of components to the talk, and I'll spend most of the time on the contents of the Varieties of Democracy dataset, and then a little bit of time in the end on this example research on electoral democracy and human development. So kind of the point of departure for the V-Dem dataset, but also I would say democracy research in general, is the fact that democracy is a contested concept. So if you ask 10 political scientists or political philosophers or others exactly what do you mean when you define or when you talk about democracy, then you will get maybe not 10, but perhaps 5 or 6 or 7 different answers. So different people have very different definitions of democracy. So it's not all kind of, there is some system and structure to these definitions. So it doesn't vary. It's not completely crazy, in the sense that there are certain categories of definitions. For example, you can classify democracy definitions into those that think of democracy as a binary variable. So either you have democracy or you don't have democracy. So either you're a democracy or you're a dictatorship. But then you have other definitions that are continuous. So you think of degrees of democracy. So you have some very democratic countries, so you have some intermediate countries, and then you have some more autocratic countries on the scale. And the measures in V-Dem are, by and large, continuous measures of democracy. So we're trying to capture degrees of democracy in the V-Dem dataset. But there is even more variation to these democracy measures. So some like to think of democracy as one particular dimension. So then they're thinking mainly, very often at least, about elections with competition between parties. So competition and perhaps also how many people are able to vote and participate in this competition. So those are minimalist definitions of democracy. So they only look at elections with competition and voting rights. But other definitions of democracy are much more broader. So they take into account other extra dimensions. So they add on top of elections, for example, different civil rights or the extent to which there is a good public debate. So different dimensions that are added on top of democracy measures. And this is kind of the core idea between V-Dem. So in the middle here, the ellipse in the middle is the electoral aspect of democracy. These are these competitive elections with extensive voting rights. And most of the existing indices before V-Dem used to focus quite a lot on electoral democracy, the electoral aspect of democracy. And then you can see the blue ellipse right on top of electoral. That's the liberal component of democracy. So that's pertaining to different civil rights, the rule of law, protection of minority rights, constraints on the chief executive, so that the president or prime minister is not allowed to do everything he or she wants, even if he or she is elected. So that's the liberal component. And most existing democracy indices captured either only the electoral component or, as for example, the polity measure, which is widely used, both the electoral and the liberal component. But then if you look at what political theorists have talked about when defining different concepts of democracy, they draw in several other aspects. So participation outside of elections, for example, in budgeting practices, as I know have been it's very famously been done in parts of Brazil, just to take one example, or through local elections, through civil society. So if you look at the orange ellipse, the deliberative component of democracy pertaining to public deliberation, open and free dialogue where you weigh arguments and try to solve public problems through coming forward to a common good solution. So the idea of V-Dem is basically to collect different measures that will allow us to measure all these aspects of democracy. And how do we do that? Well, first of all, I should note that V-Dem is not only a data set, it's also a collaboration, a large research network between researchers, democracy researchers across the world. So a lot of the V-Dem researchers are located in the United States, naturally, given that it's a large scholarly community there, but also in Europe. But we also have researchers then from various other continents and countries participating in this large research network. So it's truly a global effort to measure democracy. And the main output of this research network, in addition to a lot of collaboration on different research papers and other projects, is the large V-Dem dataset. So right now we're at V-Dem dataset version 10. So there are quite a few versions. The first of them were not public, so they were internal to the V-Dem team before we went public, I think, with so this is embarrassing if I say something wrong, but I think it was version 5 or 6. So it's been public for quite a few years, and every year in early in the spring, March, for most years, we have released the V-Dem, a new version of the V-Dem dataset. So right now it's V10, and perhaps February, March next year, we will have the V11 dataset going public. And this dataset is very comprehensive. So first of all, it's covering a lot of countries across the world. So not only independent states, but also, when going back in time, colonies and several semi-autonomous entities. So we have, for example, we're coding Hong Kong as separate from China, for example. Or when going back in time, when Norway was in a union with Sweden and with Denmark before that, we also code Norway, even though it was kind of the lesser polity in these unions. We even code Brazil before decolonization. So our time series for many entities stretch back all the way to 1789 or to the early 19th centuries. But for most of the countries, or especially many African and Asian countries, we start in 1900. So there's full coverage basically from 1900 to 2019. In the current version of the dataset, we have more than 470 different indicators. Those are indicators measuring everything from the extent of election violence to the suffrage rights, or the protection of specific civil liberties. For example, freedom of expression for men is one variable, and freedom of expression for women is another. These indicators are both factual, so they can ask, for example, how many seats were there in parliament. That's very easy to measure if you have the sources. So then we have research assistants coding those. But then V-Dem is trying to capture the more subtle, nuanced, hard to judge aspects of democracy. So for example, the extent of election violence is very hard to measure in the country. So there we rely on country experts. And this is the key feature of the V-Dem dataset, I would say, that we ask experts on, say, elections in Brazil that have worked on elections in Brazil and preferably people also living in Brazil to code the elections survey for Brazil. And then you have people working on the Norwegian media coding the media survey in Norway. So more than 3,200 country experts have actually been engaged in this coding. So in terms of this data set and some of the advantages, I would say that given that we have so many indicators tapping into different aspects of democracy and actually a lot of other political institutions and processes that are not really part of democracy either. So we have several measures, for example, tapping into the capacity of the state, corruption, things that are not obviously part of democracy. Those are also coded in the V-Dem dataset. So we have very specific and detailed questions. Then we also have a very good methodology team and a thought through methodology, because the difficulty of collecting all these data from experts in different countries is how to make sure that they're using basically the same scale, so that we can compare the score for Brazil today with the score of, say, Sweden 200 years ago. So how do we really do that? And there we have, I won't go into detail on this, but there's a whole methodological apparatus and which we refer to as the V-Dem measurement model, which takes these scores from the different experts and try to transform them onto the same scale so that they become comparable across experts and across countries and time. As you saw from this picture on the different ellipses and the different components of democracy, there's a lot of conceptual thinking. So thinking about what do we really mean with democracy? What do we mean by clean elections? Or what do we even mean by a civil society, a well-functioning civil society? A lot of theoretical and conceptual work that goes into how we construct these indices from the 470 different indicators. So we try to build up from these very specific measures to broader measures of, let's say, democracy or corruption. And there's a lot of discussion within the team underlying exactly how we do that. I think another feature that's very interesting of the V-Dem dataset is that it covers, of course, independent states, but it also covers a lot of colonies and what you could call semi-autonomous polities. So think, for example, of Hong Kong today, or think, for example, of Hungary under the Austrian-Hungarian dual monarchy. So these are also included in the dataset, at least some of them. Then most of the indicators for most of the countries go back all the way to 1900. But then there's a part of the survey, so approximately 200 questions going back to 1789 or the early 18th century for around 90 of the countries that are included. So that's the so-called historical V-Dem part of the V-Dem dataset. So here's just to give you an overview of the different aspects that are in there. These are the 11 original surveys that V-Dem coded, but after this coding, several others have been added. For example, on political exclusion, on civic and academic space, on legitimacy claims by regimes. So we have added several more, but these are kind of the 11 original surveys: elections, the executive, judiciary, civil society, political parties, the legislature, civil liberties, media, public deliberation, sovereignty, and political equality. So these are kind of tapping into various dimensions that are relevant for democracy in some way or another. But again, I would like to highlight this as a core feature of V-Dem. So because it's called Varieties of Democracy, so it's in the name, you might think that this is only a democracy data set, But I urge you to look at the extremely long code book if you're, for example, more interested in party institutionalization, in state capacity and the bureaucracy, the support coalitions underlying regimes, for example. So are there kind of business elites, or are there is the military the main supporters of the regime? So these aspects are also included in the V-Dem dataset, and more will be added now in V11. For example, on regime opposition, that will come now in V11. And some of these measures are even kind of part of the broader V-Dem umbrella, but not included directly in the V-Dem dataset. So, for example, there's a separate digital society survey focusing on social media regulation and other aspects of social media in particular. There's a separate project and dataset on restrictions and threats to democracy related to the current corona pandemic. So that's kind of not a long time series data set, but focused on the recent situation. And then just recently, members of the kind of broader V-Dem family released the V-Party data set, which is not measuring the situation in a country in a given year, but tries to capture different aspects of political parties. So different political parties in the country. So that's the V-Party. So there's a lot of these, a lot of varieties. So here's just one example, and it gets really nasty with the formula at the bottom. So this is just to give you an overview, as I won't go through this, but this is just to show you how we think when we construct these indices in the V-Dem dataset. So here you can see in the blue box with the white text, it says polyarchy. And polyarchy is V-Dem's main measure of electoral democracy. This is kind of the central core aspect of most democracy definitions. So this builds on Robert Dahl's famous notion of electoral democracy with contestation and participation. And the way we try to measure this is basically to break it down into 5 subcomponents. So suffrage, which is basically a core aspect of participation. The extent to which the executive is elected, then also direct presidential elections or indirect parliamentary elections, to which extent is also, so it's called elected officials actually, so it also pertains to where the parliament is elected. Then there's a component on whether these elections are free and fair or not, so clean elections. But then also the freedom to form political parties and other organizations, so freedom of association. And finally, the ability to, as a voter, learn information about different policies and be able to openly discuss politics is important for how elections function. So there's a freedom of expression index. So these are kind of the second level. And then going further down, you have several different indicators measuring these various sub indices. So you have very specific indices that you aggregate up to say clean elections, and then clean elections goes together with the other subcomponents into electoral democracy. And here basically is just copy pasted this from an old paper that I've written, where we show kind of the global trend in this polyarchy measure from 1789 to 2017, and then just looking at independent states. And perhaps this was a bit unfortunate since the scale here, the text is so small. But basically the polyarchy index, so this is the electoral democracy measure that I just showed you. It was just below the average for all independent states that we have data on, was below 0.1 in 1789. So the very minimum is 0. So this is the average across all countries. And then the maximum is 1, but that's just an ideal. And so that's the ideal maximum score. So no countries in the V-Dem dataset have so far achieved anything very close to 1. So you have countries scoring 0.91, 0.92, but not much more than that. So basically, this shows you the global trend. So here, for example, you could discuss, if you're familiar with the work on democratization waves and Huntington's 3 waves of democratization, you will here see the long kind of the long first wave in the 19th century with some movements here in the middle of the century. This is the year of revolution, 1848-49. And then you have a spike right after the end of the First World War, democratic decline, and this is the global average, democratic decline in the interwar period, and then again a spike after the Second World War. Downturn, with especially coming with decolonization in many African and some Asian countries. And then here you have the third wave of democratization from the mid-1970s. And basically then for the last few years, as you are all probably aware of, there has been at best stagnation, but also some decline in the democracy, average democracy level globally. And this stops in 2017. So if I were to kind of extend the line, it would go down even a bit more for the two to three last years. So this is basically kind of capturing these broad global trends that democracy scholars have been talking a lot about, going all the way back to the French Revolution. And you can see the blue band around this, around the line. And that's a very important aspect of the V-Dem dataset. Since we have multiple expert coders, we're also, and use this measurement model, we also give uncertainty estimates on exactly how sure we are about this democracy score. So maybe we cannot be sure that let's say, the United Kingdom today is a 0.85 or whatever it is. Maybe it's a 0.89 or a 0.81. So the extent of uncertainty is something that we track in V-Dem. So this is then here reflected also with these confidence bands for the global average. So basically the 95, you can think of this as a 95% confidence interval. Yeah. I should make sure to get through all the material. So I'll try to be a bit quick, but here is just to show you the country coverage. And as you might see for certain countries, including Brazil, there has been a decline over the last few years in this electoral democracy index. So you can see that Brazil, for example, has become less dark blue and a bit lighter blue over the last years. Okay, so I basically this is just a map of the different components going into the polyarchy index. So just making this point that we can then look at these more specific components, and you will see that all of these aspects of democracy have not moved in tandem across global history. For example, you can see suffrage, which is the blue solid line. Basically, most countries today that have elections have full suffrage, more or less. So it peaked relatively early. Whereas other aspects of democracy, like, for example, clean elections, the green long dash line here, there's a lot more issues going on with free and fair elections, even in the world today. Here are similar trends then for all these other aspects of democracy, liberal democracy, participatory democracy, deliberative democracy, and egalitarian democracy. So other core aspects of democracy that we also measure in V-Dem. But maybe equally interesting to looking at these kind of broad trends in kind of very broad notions of democracy. Is to look at these more specific indicators that are included in V-Dem. So here, for example, is just one graph, and this is again just to illustrate the contents of the data set. So underlying this polyarchy or electoral democracy index, if you remember the slide where I showed you the composition, you could see that there were components and then there were multiple specific indicators for each component. So if you see the red marked or the red colored indicators here in this diagram, these are basically freedom of expression indicators, media censorship, academic and cultural expression. Sorry. media bias, etc. So these are the freedom of expression indicators. Then you have indicators in blue measuring freedom of association, party bans, barriers to parties, multi-party elections. And then you have these black dots, which are registering aspects of free and fair elections, the Clean Elections Index. So electoral intimidation, is there an accurate voter registry, etc. Vote buying, election monitoring board capacity. So these are the kind of the fine-grained building blocks in the V-Dem dataset, which we compose these broader indices of. And this graph basically shows you the change in these different indicators. So if you look down to the very, very specific level of institutions and particular processes, and it takes the average globally. So it looks at how has these indicators changed globally from 2007 to 2017. And you can think of this as all of the indicators that are in the top left quadrant here, above the 45-degree line. These are the indicators that improved on average globally from 2007 to 2017. So electoral intimidation improved, and in V-Dem we always try to measure kind of good things as positive. So that basically means less intimidation in elections, less vote buying, stronger capacity for the electoral monitoring board. So on average, these kind of core electoral indicators increased during this time span from 2007 to 2017. What really declined were indicators related to freedom of expression and the media, and also different aspects related to civil society, repression of civil society, barriers to parties, the difficulty of having a new civil society organization being registered, for example. So actually, in this kind of this period of time, which some have referred to as the third wave of autocratization, where kind of democracy globally is stagnating and autocracies are actually on the rise over the last few years. One characteristic of this time period has been that especially media and civil society aspects have been in decline the most, whereas elections have actually, until very recently at least, still been improving. So it's the more kind of subtle pillars of democracy that have been mainly under threat in many countries. So how do I think V-Dem might contribute to the broader research community on democracy and issues of democratization, democratic backsliding? Well, I just highlighted 5 implications that I think V-Dem has to offer for democracy research, and of course being part of the V-Dem dataset, and I'm mainly going to offer you the positive implications, which I hope is representative of what V-Dem brings to the table. I think one particular aspect is all the methodological attention that has gone into how to measure these indices, dealing with measurement errors, trying to be as careful as possible, both to measure things accurately, but even to be honest and open about the remaining sources of uncertainty. And dealing with these measurement errors and letting people know that when you say that the democracy is scored at the 0.9 instead of a 0.85 or a 0.95, that could give us a basis for making more well-founded conclusions, both when we describe how democracies develop over time, so that we're not jumping to conclusions from something that's kind of a measurement error in the data set, but also for how we conclude when we study the causes and consequences of democracy. It's important to take into account. Then second, and perhaps more obviously, I mean, since we are trying to measure different varieties of democracy, so deliberative democracy, egalitarian democracy, participatory democracy, it makes it much easier to now actually study the causes and consequences of these other aspects of democracy, rather than just relying on electoral measures or electoral measures with liberal components or liberal democracy. Now we can actually start to both empirically test different hypotheses on what drives good public deliberation, for example, And I think also when we have these measures and we see them and work with them, many democracy scholars on a day-to-day basis, we also start to think and theorize more about these concepts. So not only for empirical testing, but when you get new results, you kind of spur more theoretical innovation also perhaps in these other varieties of democracy. So that, I hope, will be one implication of the V-Dem dataset. Along the same lines, the fact that there are so many specific institutional indicators. So for example, if I'm not really interested in democracy as such, but maybe I'm interested in vote buying in particular. Well, then V-Dem has coverage on vote buying back to 1789 for a broad range of countries. Different measures on different specific indicators means that it's much easier now to go in and try to test different hypotheses about more specific phenomena, and then also perhaps use these empirical insights in new theorizing. So disentangling the role of specific institutions, is it really suffrage or is it really vote buying? That's important, for example, when you look at effects on, say, economic growth. That's something you can now test with V-Dem data. Then fourth, I think how institutions function. So since V-Dem tries to measure subjective aspects, ask country experts to evaluate institutions, we're not only registering whether or not there are multiple parties competing, but we're also asking them how the elections function. That means that we can dig into some of the more informal, in practice aspects of how democracies function. That is important. And then finally, I think by having such a long historical time series, it makes it easier to do historical work on the rise of democracy and state building in the 19th century, for example. And also, given that we measured the political situation in colonies, which have basically been completely absent from previous datasets, standard datasets on democracy, means that we can start studying kind of how these often very, very autocratic political systems functioned and their effects. So I hope to see a lot of work on the causes and effects of different forms of colonial rule using V-Dem. Okay, so then I'll try to be quick and do 5 minutes on the application so that we have time for questions and answer. So this is a paper written together with John Gehring, Matthew Maguire, Sven-Erik Skåning, Jan Thorell, Michael Coppridge. And it's actually a paper looking into, so it's recently published this year in Democratization, and it's looking into different aspects of democracy, so trying to use the V-Dem dataset to disentangle different aspects of democracy and see what drives what we call then broadly human development. What we mainly study in this paper are different forms of mortality, and particularly infant mortality. So which aspects of democracy tend to reduce or go together with reduced infant mortality, which is a core feature of the human condition, seeing your babies live to be older than 1 year old. So in this previous literature, and when people talk about human development, so they mean kind of development more broadly than only economic development, not only GDP per capita. And oftentimes they focus on different aspects related to health, kind of mortality, life expectancy, or to educational outcomes, literacy, for example. But many of the studies have indeed studied infant mortality in particular, since it's kind of tracked with long time series and possible to study in, especially in statistical studies. But this statistical study has actually found quite mixed results. So many studies do find that democracy, so whenever a country goes from being very autocratic through a democratization process, infant mortality in a few years down the road tends to fall. So a lot of studies find that democracy is good for reducing infant mortality, but the results differ from study to study. And it, for example, differs according to the time period on the study or exactly how you measure mortality or human development more generally. So what we do in this paper is basically to say that, well, what people haven't done before is basically, so they try to look at different aspects of human development, but they haven't looked at very different aspects of democracy. So it might very well be that some features of democracy are really important for driving down infant mortality, whereas other aspects of democracy are less important. And if these things are combined together in one composite index, then I mean the results might be very strange. So we want to disentangle and look at the specific aspects of democracy and try to disaggregate. So we draw on data from 150 countries and from 1900 to the mid-2010s. I don't remember the exact end year now, to be honest, but from 1900 and onwards. And basically the main findings of this study is that human development, and then we measure different mortality features and life expectancy, but we focus in on infant mortality, seems to be very strongly related to the electoral aspect of democracy. So having in place elections, having free and fair elections, that's really, really important. So not only kind of any kind of elections, but having good information out to the voters. There are competing parties, there's little cheating, little vote buying. Under these conditions, when democracy, electoral democracy works very well, we find that this really goes together with substantially lower infant mortality. When we go in and see, well, isn't kind of the organization of the civil society or the empowerment of different groups or more kind of egalitarian aspects of democracy, isn't that really important for infant mortality, which we would expect according to many theories? And there we don't find too clear results. So we do find some indications that some other aspects matter, but it's not as clear as for electoral democracy. So we do find that the clean elections is basically super important. And then we also discuss in this paper how we specifically compose the measures, so how we basically aggregate together the different features of elections. That also matters for which results we get. And we find this to be a very, very strong result. And just to give you the short story in 30 seconds, the story here is about the importance of disciplining the incumbent politicians who are on top of the state. So we don't go around assuming that all democratic politicians are inherently good and want to spend money on healthcare in rural areas for poor people. But we say that whenever there are free and fair elections, and these politicians need to cater to voters, also relatively poor voters in the rural areas, for example, then they get a very, very strong incentive to spend, for example, healthcare spending or kind of water wells, or things that basically improves the health and well-being of families and reduces infant mortality. A voter that sees his or her child die due to poor government policies is probably not going to vote for the incumbent in the upcoming free and fair election, or hopefully not. So we think of this as a story of how to incentivize politicians to spend money on good healthcare for all people in the polity, and ensure vertical accountability between citizens and politicians. And this is basically just to show you some of the statistical results. So here we're basically taking our measure of electoral democracy, the multiplicative polyarchy index, and in these tests we run them together. So we run them together with alternative democracy measures, and we see which of these measures, when we compare them in the same setup, correlate with reduced infant mortality. And we find that this multiplicative polyarchy index is very strongly related to reduced infant mortality. So I'm going to conclude there and stop for discussions. Generally, different aspects of democracy may have very different effects. In this case, it turns out that the electoral aspect of democracy is really important for reducing infant mortality, but for other important outcomes, for example, economic growth or whatever, there might be different aspects of democracy that are relevant. So the point is that we should theorize and test different features of democracy. And also, I think this highlights the last point here, that with the V-Dem data, we have very long time series. And if you're going to study something as slow moving as infant mortality, which changes just incrementally from year to year, you really need a lot of information over long periods of time if you're going to study that. And this is also another beneficial feature of the V-Dem data. So thank you for your attention.
So thank you, Professor Knutsen, from this very insightful presentation. I believe we have time now for some questions. So we will start with the question from Mateus. Is showing in the screen right now. He's asking, some countries like USA and Brazil recently received severe downgrades in the V-Dem liberal democracy score, with significant change occurring from one year to the next. What explains that?
Yeah, so that is a really good question. I can actually start by, so I should probably say this that I haven't dug into the exact components of Brazil's score, for example. I have looked a bit more at the United States, but I could mention that on the V-Dem webpage, so that's vdem.net, there is a so-called online graphing tool, online analysis tool, where if you start out, you can pick particular countries, and then you can pick particular years, and then you can look at the liberal democracy index and how it changes. And then what is really nice about this online graphing tool is that you can then dig into these particular indicators that go into liberal democracy and then you will very quickly see which exact measures that are moving. But to answer the question, when looking at the United States, for example, over these last years, you could see actually there's quite a few features that have been moving. And without having dug into Brazil, I could also imagine that some of the same features would be relevant for the Brazilian case. But again, you should check this online site instead of trusting me on that. But what you could see there is different features pertaining to kind of both the media environment, freedom of expression, more kind of different, more subtle forms of self-censorship, academic freedom. So these kind of softer pillows of democracy, not necessarily related to the conduct on election day, but actually how the public debate functions, how if opposition forces are free to express their meanings without kind of harassment, for example. These things have been moving in several countries, as I showed you, and I would imagine that this is the case for Brazil to some extent. I mean, still there's a scale, right? So democracy in Brazil is still scored, I think, around electoral democracy around 0.65 or something in V-Dem, but it's been a quite substantial drop. And for the US also, features related to the media, for example, moved pretty early, public deliberation as well. Other than that, I won't. So it's not necessarily kind of the conduct of elections as such that have been driving it down. And it also shows, I think, that we have a very demanding threshold for being coded very high on our democracy scales. So if you start to see violations to different democratic principles in V-Dem, if you're starting out as a very democratic country, then you will see these downgrades. So for many indices, polity, for example, you're basically often stuck at +10 all the way, even when there are different violations to democratic principles in V-Dem. This is something that often kicks in.
Thank you. The next question is a very direct question from Amanda. She's asking, in what sense does V-Dem, in terms of democracy classification, present itself as a better option than older options like Polit4 and Freedom House, for example?
So I actually had thank you for that question. It's of course a question I like to respond to. I actually had a slide in there for this presentation that I cut out, which explicitly compares V-Dem with Polity and Freedom House. And I think there are multiple things that V-Dem does better. So mainly V-Dem is kind of motivated by democracy researchers coming together and kind of seeing a lot of issues with the existing measures that they wanted to improve. So there's been a very conscious decision to correct some of what is perceived as shortcomings with Polity and Freedom House. First of all, I mean, neither Polity nor Freedom House was originally intended as democracy measures. And one thing that's often been pointed to is that it's really unclear what the underlying concept behind the Freedom House Index is. So it's a collection of liberties, whereas Polity is actually measuring a very specific theoretical concept that is not necessarily the same as democracy, but they're often used as democracy measures. So I think the fact that V-Dem has multiple measures that are explicitly tying into the kind of the core democracy concepts in literature is one. I think the second point is related to the level of detail in the indicators. The fact that we're going and looking at very small details and building up these indices also means that we can capture a lot of more nuanced, subtle variation. So, for example, as I talked about, countries that score really high on democracy, when you start seeing processes of that undermine democratic principles, it's much easier to get changes in V-Dem than in these other measures. We take measurement errors very, very seriously. So I think that's a particularly important feature. So altogether, I mean, when looking at these different classifications, I would say that for most democracy concepts, V-Dem is superior. So think, for example, of electoral democracy. So polity doesn't really weigh in suffrage, right? So you have the top score for many countries, including my own, from the year when there was full male suffrage. So the fact that Norway extended suffrage to women doesn't really register on polity. It was a +10 long before women got the vote. And to me, as a democracy scholar, I think that's unfortunate if we're trying to capture electoral democracy. So those are only some of the things, and we measure colonies and go longer back in time than the others, especially Freedom House.
Next question is actually another question from Mateus. He's asking, due to V-Dem's reliance on human coders, how susceptible are democracy and corruption indexes to short-term transitory events?
That's a super good question. And I've actually written myself on corruption indices, especially corruption. I think the question is it's relevant for all kind of subjective measurements. I think especially for corruption, which is kind of by its nature very hidden. Whenever you see a scandal, then people tend to update their priors on exactly how much corruption there is going on. So, for example, is there a big revelation of a corruption scandal tomorrow in a country, let's say Canada, then maybe people start thinking that Canada is inherently more corrupt, even if the corruption has been there all along, and then they update. So I think that's a feature that we can't really escape with human coders, and I think especially for corruption or other features that are pretty hidden, where there are incentives to hide information, that's a difficult features. So the extent to which we try to deal with this in V-Dem is basically, so for example, relying on multiple coders. So of course, all coders might have the same bias, and if so, the index we would kind of be in the same position. But the fact that coders might have different biases or react differently to this tends to water out some of these fluctuations. The other thing is that this measurement model, it uses different pieces of information to consider the reliability of expert codings. And then the more reliable experts are weighed in more heavily. But I think perhaps the most important feature of V-Dem is that the questions are as specific as possible. So for example, we don't ask about kind of corruption, like grand corruption 1 question. We ask much more specific questions about theft, bribery, different processes of corruption, particularly in the bureaucracy, in the legislature, in government. So we ask very specific questions, which hopefully, since they are so specific, the coders are forced to think more concretely, and therefore also hopefully less susceptible to kind of different biases and reacting generally to perceptions and events. But it's a feature we cannot fully deal with, but we try to minimize it through these different methodological strategies.
Thank you. The next question is from Marcus. He's asking, which are the biggest problems in data collection, accuracy, and transparency in V-Dem, and how to overcome it?
I think again, I'm very happy to get these methodological questions. I think the most difficult question that V-Dem has been struggling with for years, and I think has spent a lot of resources on trying to overcome, has been, of course, to be able to identify and recruit all the experts is really difficult. But then the main challenge is how to ensure that the scores given by different experts. So if Rodrigo and I were to code, let's say, either Norway or Brazil, then we might have very different scales, right? So maybe I'm using the extremes of the scale more. So I'm saying either it's super good or it's super bad, whereas Rodrigo is more modest and he will say, well, it's kind of a 4 or a 2, but it's not a 0 or a 5. And if this is due to differences in expert personalities, how do you really make these scores comparable? So this is kind of a very tricky methodological problem that V-Dem has spent a lot of resources and have kind of methodological experts working on. And where I think also the V-Dem project has contributed quite a lot. Dan Pemstein and others on the team have worked a lot with this type of methodology, so IRT, Bayesian measurement models, and published and done a lot of research actually based on experiences with V-Dem data that also kind of contributes to more general methodological development. So I think this is the most tricky question. Of course, we try to collect different pieces of information about the experts and look at comparisons across experts, different experts coding different countries, and feed this into this measurement model and make all scores comparable. But to some extent, it's hard to guarantee fully that everything is 100% comparable across countries and over time. That's something that we still kind of can always improve this methodological aspect. So I'd say that is the most difficult one. In terms of transparency, I think V-Dem aims to be very transparent. So not only publishing all indicator scores, but also kind of being very transparent in kind of the protocol and exactly how things are done. The only thing that we don't reveal is the name of the expert coders, and that's due to the expert's security. So you don't want to be the North Korean country expert and get your name publicly available. So I don't even know the name of the expert coders, right? So we know who we ask and recruit in, but we don't know exactly who accept and do the coding. And this is due to safety reasons.
I promise you have only 2 more questions. We will not hold you.
No worries, no worries.
We now have a question from Elizabeth. She's asking, some concepts that V-Dem attempts to measure are typically complex and hard to observe, like corruption. Does V-Dem conduct specific research to test the measure on the field to assess their validity?
Yeah, another good methods question. I think there's, if you want to look at, there's a really good validation piece on the corruption measures in V-Dem by Kelly McMahon, Jan Theorell, Brigitte Seim, and others. I don't remember at the moment exactly where it was published, but these types of kind of research on validation was kind of a core part of has been a core part of the project and led to several articles, kind of data articles on both the methodology but also the validity of these measures. So I should probably have shown the front page of the V-Dem book that came out early this year on Cambridge University Press. So there's a book that also contains a lot of information about how we go about when considering validity of different measures. But they're kind of all the standard tests. So convergent validity tests, for example, looking at how it overlaps with or correlates with other measures of similar phenomena. Face validity tests, so having people that are really knowledgeable about the country digging into these measures and see if they make sense. All of these things. So because these data are very kind of in very high profile and very public, we also, of course, received a lot of scrutiny from others and suggestions for improvement. So, but the validation is something that V-Dem has taken very seriously. And again, I think the corruption measures are probably some of the more difficult to measure, and that's going to be the case for any project that tries to measure corruption, I think.
Okay, so our last question is from Paloma. She's asking, which parts of the V-Dem indexes are useful to understand the population strain in countries like Hungary and Turkey?
Yeah, no, that's very, very interesting. If you look at across the different measures, you will actually see that there are quite a few of these measures that have been moving. I always find it very interesting to start out with some of these broader indices. So, for example, the Liberal Democracy Index, and see which exact aspects is it that seem to drive this downward trend. I think when it comes to populism, I think a lot of the measures from the more Liberal Democracy Index are relevant for understanding certain parts of the decline, at least. And that pertains to the protections of minority rights, but perhaps for a country like Hungary, also the situation of the judiciary, so the independence of the judiciary. Media freedom is something that I mentioned. That's part of the electoral democracy measure. That's also something that I think is important. So some populist movements also, I mean, there are aspects to populism that you can construe as pro-democratic in certain features. You want to listen to the people. So elements of, if you want to look at other aspects that might be related to populism in a different manner, you could look at participatory democracy, for example, the use of direct democracy instruments, for example, perhaps, yeah. But again, I think the Liberal Democracy Index and these different civil society aspects, media aspects of electoral democracy, different rights, and the role of the judiciary, I think, has been key in many of these countries.
So with this last answer, we are closing this panel. So Professor Knutsen, it was an honor to hear what you had to say. It was a very insightful presentation. So thank you again for talking to us.
Thank you, and thank you so much for the very insightful question. When I saw the quality of the questions, I thought maybe I should have done some more methods, but maybe next time.
Of course. So thank you, and para vocês que estão acompanhando a gente também, muito obrigado e até o próximo evento Métodos em Pauta.